So our job is to help you get your information out to the maximum amount of people.
Okay.
And the people who do watch this information, they're a very eclectic bunch. We've got 16-year-old kids who've just woken up last month saying, what's going on around here? Tell me, tell me. And then we've got seasoned researchers like yourself, who, and even insiders themselves, who watch our videos to get a feel for what's really going on.
Okay.
And so one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you was because you're a very cogent, lucid and articulate presenter of some very difficult information. I'm sure other people have told you that as well, but we recognize that.
Okay.
And we apologize for putting you under the camera here to the extent that you don't have your slideshow, or you don't have any prompts, and you don't have any notes.
I'll do shadows.
The feeling we had about you is that you have a very good grasp of your information, and we respect that as well. So here we go, we're rolling. So I'm Bill Ryan from Project Camelot. I'm here with my colleague Kerry Cassidy, and we're delighted to also be here with Joseph Farrell. And off camera, just a few moments ago, I checked that it was okay to call you Joe.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're among friends here, and that makes me feel a little bit more relaxed. And you may be wondering, and some of our viewers may be wondering, how come this is Bill here who's doing this interview? And just as a little bit of a personal introduction about myself, and also maybe to some of our newer viewers, if we were the real X-Files, I would actually be Scully.
Okay.
Meaning, I'm the one who's slightly more scientific, slightly more skeptical, slightly more cautious.
Right.
And this is why, between us, many people feel, and we feel ourselves, that we make quite a good team. Okay. So I have a math and physics background.
Okay.
I tend not to leap to wild conclusions, but at the same time I'm very happy to think out of the box.
Sure. As
I strongly suspect you do as well.
Right.
And one of the reasons why we really wanted to talk to you, besides the very high professional quality of your presentation on various interviews that we've listened to prepare ourselves for this, is that the pieces of the jigsaw that you have collected through your diligent research seem to us to be essential understanding for anyone who really wants to know what's going on today in geopolitics, in terms of black science, maybe even in terms of global agenda, who's running the show, how it all started, where it all started, and when it all started.
Okay.
And for the benefit of some of our viewers who may not know who you are, despite that introduction, give us your elevator speech about who is Joe Farrell and how did you come to do what you're doing right now?
Well, Cliff Notes version, my father was an engineer, so I kind of grew up in a household where science was always kind of a main thing to be stressed, and I've always been, individually interested in it. And for quite a long period when I was a child, and all through high school later on, I wanted to be a physicist. And then my senior year I got senioritis, I'm afraid, and wimped out of calculus and selected music theory as my alternative study, but that proved to be almost as difficult, if not more so. So I was also a musician, and I got into music, and then when I was in college I took philosophy, and that diverted me even further away from my original goal into philosophy and ancient texts. I've also always been interested in history and ancient things and mysteries and so on and so forth. So I did my PhD in England and then taught college for a number of years.
In Oxford? Were you?
No, I wasn't a professor at all at Oxford. I just did my PhD there. I actually taught college in Oklahoma. And it was mostly philosophy and history, but I did do an interdisciplinary seminar at one period of time, and that was a team-taught seminar. And the way the other professor and I had to kind of divvy up the various disciplines that we were trying to pull together, well, she was a biologist, so she handled certain things, and I got physics because that's always been kind of a hobby, even though I abandoned the professional pursuit of it. So we also discovered we had a common interest, as it were, in the esoteric and alternative things, and I presented some of my pyramid ideas to her, and she says, "Oh, you've got to do that for the class." So I did it for the class, and they kind of really liked it, much to my surprise. And after I quit college teaching, I decided, well, you know, I might as well bite the bullet and write some of my crazy ideas down. So that's kind of that's kind of how I got started in all of this. So that's how it came about.
So you're quite a polymath.
I have a lot of interests. Yeah, I wouldn't say polymath, but yeah, I've got a broad spectrum of interests.
Yes, you've already answered one of my questions, which is how come it appears evidently that you have such a grasp of the physics which your research has led you to be entangled with, if I can use that word.
Oh yeah, well, when I was growing up, I was the quintessential nerd. I mean, fun for me when I was a boy was playing with my daddy's slide rule, you know. So that kind of gives you the idea of what kind of person. I've always been a reader, and to this day, I still like to try and find physics papers online and pull them up and read and see what's going on. So that's kind of what I am.
Well, good for you, because it sounds like, from what we can gather, having talked to mutual colleagues such as Richard Hoagland and Jim Mars, who we interviewed just this morning, is that you're providing a real service in the information chain, as it were, in terms of providing researchers who are trying their best to assemble a big picture.
Right.
With some specific drill-down components that you seem eminently qualified to have stumbled across, or perhaps that sounds too clumsy. Actually, maybe you've been going after them very deliberately ever since you realized that there was something to go after. Would you say that was correct?
Maybe somewhere between the two. One of the things that always struck me, my academic background is actually in theology. And it always struck me that many of the methods that theologians use are very similar in some respects to methods that physicists use. And that may sound wildly contradictory to what most people would think. But in looking at ancient texts, particularly philosophical texts, it always struck me that I was looking at a kind of a topological metaphor rather than specifically a metaphysical text. And the further I went back, the more apparent that metaphor became, and to the point that it even became possible to notate certain concepts in text with the actual notation conventions of topology. So I thought, well, you know, wow, that's kind of wild. So I didn't share it with, you know, doing a PhD. I didn't share that idea with anybody, you know. But after I quit college teaching, I began to look at text that way and to see, and I had done it privately. I'm not saying that, you know, all of a sudden I decided to do this. I'd been doing it privately for a number of years and keeping little notebooks of it. But yeah, it was kind of half accident and kind of an ongoing interest, so somewhere between the two.
But there's something that must have got you started specifically on the treasure trail that led you to putting together a lot of the sub-jigsaw that was what were the Nazis really doing before and during World War II,
right,
that nobody else seems to have really realized. What was it that led you in that direction? What were the first things you found?
Well, the thing that always struck me that I don't think has, and I don't even include myself in this category, the thing that has always struck me about what kind of research the Nazis were doing is, on the one hand, you have a definite esoteric occult influence and interest that midwifes the Nazi Party into existence. You have a definite esoteric and occult influence at work after the Nazis take power. And, you know, one of the things I like to point out is that the Nazi state with the SS and Heinrich Himmler when he creates the Ahnenerbendienst, the so-called Ancestral Research Bureau. If you go to the Nuremberg tribunals and pull up the brief, you have to kind of dig for it, but you can eventually find it. It's a short little statement, declaration that establishes this thing. But one of the things that he puts in as one of the purposes for this department is that it is to investigate all of these areas for their potential military application. Okay? So we have that influence at work. And then on the other hand, as you know, being mathematics and physics background, you have during that period of say 1920 up to about 1931-32, you have this spate of publications in Germany of various unified field theories, Kaluza, Einstein, Eddington, and so on and so forth. So you have that kind of scientific ferment at work. And then, of course, you add Gabriel Krohn into the mix, a Hungarian fellow electrical engineer who says, hey, you know, he wins a prize at the University of Liège in Belgium for a paper in which he says, well, we electrical engineers notice all of these anomalies in large rotating electrical systems, and we can explain those anomalies by appealing to these higher dimensional physics unified field theories. So in other words, if you stop and think of the implications of what he said, the technology of electrical circuitry circa 1935 is producing anomalies only explainable by these higher dimensional mathematical physics theories. He's telling you, in other words, these theories are engineerable. They may be incomplete in the theoretical sense, but they're nonetheless engineerable theories, and that's an important statement.
Which is highly significant,
Oh,
because
yes,
he's marrying
absolutely.
two totally different worlds.
Yes.
The engineering and the practical,
Yes.
and the abstruse and the mathematical.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that struck me, I've just acquired some of Krohn's papers. I went out and bought one of his books, a little old Dover book publication. But what he does is he takes the tensor calculus and uses it as a way of analyzing electrical machines.
Now, this is Einstein's tensor calculus from his 1928 unified field paper.
This is right. And one of the things specifically that you'll notice in Krohn, although he doesn't come right out and tell you, I'm now going to show you how torsion works, is he appeals to that very concept. So you've got these two very different things going on as kind of an intellectual ferment in Germany at the time. You've got the esoteric and occult interest, and you have this very abstruse theoretical and engineering interest. Now, I've always suspected that there is some sort of connection between the two, and this is kind of what got me interested in the whole Bell story, because the department of the German government that is conducting all of this very exotic research is precisely the SS.
What year are we talking about now?
That's another good question. The Bell Project itself, I think you can make a kind of a case, actually has its conceptual kind of proof of concept stage beginnings before the Nazis take power, and may have been as early as circa 1924 and 25.
That early?
That early. And the reason I say that is in one of my books I reproduce this little, kind of a two-column filler article that ran in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, I think it was, but it was written by none other than Dr. Walter Gerlach. Now, Walter Gerlach, you know, he's one of the most famous physicists at that time of history. He's a Nobel Prize winner, you know, of the famous Stern-Gerlach experiment. I thought, well, whoa, because what he's talking about in this article is the possibility of the transmutation of elements, specifically in regard to mercury, to gold, and he's calling it a new alchemy. And that really brought me up short, because, you know, this is, number one, before the discovery of nuclear fission by Otto Hahn, okay? So he's got some very different concept in his head.
And he's a smart guy.
And he's a very smart guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is not a second stringer, you know. And when he uses this word alchemy, it's just crystal clear. You know, I even reproduced the original German article and then translate it, so you know that I'm not making this stuff up, folks.
It's the same word in German, isn't it?
Oh yeah, alchemy, yeah.
Alchemy.
You can see it right there in the article. So he writes this article, and then it's very clear, he makes a kind of a final little statement that, you know, this should be investigated further, and to do so is going to, you know, hint, hint, require a lot of money. You know, so this is kind of the typical scientist's appeal to the government. All right.
Okay.
Well, the reason I think that the project may have begun at this time is because it is precisely Dr. Walter Gerlach who is the project head of the Bell for the Nazis.
Okay.
See?
Now, Joe, I wonder if I could stop you here, because
Sure.
what we've got here is we've got the first 10 minutes of what's sounding like a really interesting movie where no one's quite sure what's going on here,
Yeah,
but they're
right.
interested.
Okay.
Now, for our viewers, okay, we've talked about Einstein, tensor calculus, something
Right.
that sounds very abstrusely mathematical,
It
but not
is.
everyone's going to understand. The Nazis, and something called the Bell. So what's the plot line here? Why should anyone
Pay
care
attention to
about
this.
this extraordinary story?
All right, very simple. It's my belief, just to give you kind of a very short Cliff Notes answer, it's my belief, number one, that the Nazi atom bomb project was successful. Now, what I'm going to do is simply ask your viewers to accept that as kind of a given for the sake of argument, so that I can kind of set the context, okay? If you look at the project classification of the Bell, the Nazis classified it as Kriegsentscheidend. In other words, within the classification system of the Third Reich, the Bell was classified absolutely uniquely and at the very pinnacle of the system, and it is the only project in Nazi Germany to be given that specific classification. In other words, higher than the atom bomb. Okay? So in other words, to the Nazis, the atom bomb is, you know, already kind of old stuff. Okay? So that gives an indicator of what the significance is. But if you look at the physics that they're trying to investigate, I believe they're investigating it for three things, for the purposes of achieving three things. Number one, they want to free Germany from energy dependence on foreign powers and foreign oil. So in other words, they're investigating the so-called zero-point energy. Okay? Number two, the same sort of physics they have seen is kind of a gateway or window into advanced field propulsion, or anti-gravity, if you want to call it that. And the third thing, of course, Nazis being Nazis, is that they want to engineer this physics for a weapon. And of course, we're dealing now with a physics that, again, can engineer the fabric of space-time locally.
Okay, now, just once again to summarize this before we go into even more detail.
Sure.
What you're referring to here is you've picked up the research line that was started by
Igor Witkowski.
Nick Cook and Igor Witkowski, this thing that seems to have been called, well, for lack of a better word, the Nazi Bell. We don't know what they called it, do we?
Well, actually, they did call it Die Glocke.
Die Glocke.
And they had another nickname for it, Der Bienenstock, the beehive, because of the sound it made. But one of the actual project code names was Projekt Kronos, or Project Time. Okay? Now, many people leap to the conclusion that, well, they're trying to build a time machine. Well, no. Time is involved, because again, you're trying to use torsion to tap into the ability to manipulate the fabric of space-time.
What's torsion?
All right. Torsion, the way I like to illustrate it very simply, is if you take a soda can and empty the soda out of it and then wring it like a dish rag. You've got that counter-rotating motion, and it's going to spiral and fold and pleat that can and then draw the ends of the can closer together. So that kind of is my simplistic illustration of what torsion does. And the can itself would represent space-time. Okay? Now, what they're doing, I think, ultimately for the Nazis, the purpose of this is they want to weaponize it. And of course, and I've said this over and over again in my interviews, if you're dealing with a technology that has the potential to engineer space-time, that means that if you weaponize that, potentially you have a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. It's truly planet-busting stuff if you've got the proper engineering behind it and, you know, develop appropriate power systems and so on, which, again, this one and the same thing will lead to zero-point energy, so there's your power, you know.
And there are some very smart scientists
yes.
in that time.
Oh,
I
yes,
mean,
absolutely.
one might actually say the world's finest, would you say?
I would say so, and again, you know, this is why I kind of prefaced my remarks by mentioning the atom bomb, because the kind of the post-war Allied legend, as I like to call it, is, of course, the Germans were a bunch of nuclear bunglers, you know, and they didn't have enough manpower and they didn't have enough money, you know, and all of this happy nonsense that you hear in the textbooks. Well, to me, this story really doesn't make much sense. But, and you're right, they've got Heisenberg, they've got Hartek. I mean, these people are not second stringers at all. So, yeah, what the Germans are doing, and I want to emphasize here the importance of why Nazism would be the ideological cauldron for this. Because Nazism, of course, had banned Jewish physics, in other words, relativity, okay? And they even had ideological difficulties with aspects of quantum mechanics because it was too statistical, it was too probabilistic, it wasn't deterministic enough for some of the Nazi ideologues. But what is implied by this in the standard history is that within Nazi Germany you have an absolute stamping out of the scientific method and a dead ending of physics. But I think if you look now, 100 years after relativity, we see precisely that physics has dead ended. We have this kind of dogma in place now. What I think Nazism really did is it freed those people in a certain way to think outside the box. And all of that outside the box thinking took place inside the confines of the SS. And the signal event that kicks all this loose now in modern times, the reason we're finding out about it, is precisely German reunification.
Yes.
Why? Because when the Eastern Zone is basically annexed in a shotgun wedding by West Germany, and that's exactly how I would describe it, when that happens, all of those old SS installations in the Eastern Zone, some of which the Soviets didn't even get into, you know, the SS blew them up and the Soviets never bothered to go into them. The Germans went back in there and looked at all this stuff, and it wasn't showing up on any radar screen connected with rockets or jet aircraft or poison gas, you know, any of the other stuff that they were doing. And so they began to wonder, well, what's going on here? And then, of course, Igor finds that very strange hinge-like structure there in Ludwikowice, I think, in Poland, which used to be Ludwigsdorf, and he's wondering, well, what is this? You know, why is this here? And, of course, this kicks loose the spate of declassification. This kicks loose a bunch of people coming forward from the old Eastern Zone, now able to talk about what they saw, what they observed. So this has kicked loose a fantastic amount of information.
It's very interesting what you were saying about that. Let me rephrase what you were saying. The crucible of the state's support and the state's agenda was a perfect support system for a scientist who wanted the funding and the motivation
and to think outside the box.
And all the resources to go and play with his toys
Right.
and to do what all scientists really want to do, which is to invent something wild
Yes,
that works.
that's exactly.
And what some of our listeners will already be thinking is like, they'll be thinking, wait a minute, this is what's happening in Los Alamos and Hughes and Sandia and Bell Labs right now.
Yes,
at a different
right.
time, in a different Reich,
Right.
which
Yes.
is what Jim Myers would say.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much of an argument with him either.
But what I also think you're saying, at the risk of putting words into your mouth, is that if we want to understand that stuff that I just mentioned, then we need to go back to exactly this data trail that you've been following, because this is because what we're seeing nowadays is a progeny of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, Nazi Germany is, you know, it's really a weird state when you examine the scientific implications of it, because let me go back to that SS department that Himmler sets up. Okay, you're going to go out there and you're going to research the Aryan heritage. If we look at the Nazi state and we go back to what Himmler sets up with this department, and he says, all right, go out and investigate all of the aspects of the ancient Aryan heritage, but the mission brief is broad enough that he gives them. Basically, you have a department, excuse me, of the Nazi state created specifically for the purpose to investigate the esoteric, the occult, the hermetic, whatever you want to call all of this ancient lore, okay, for the specific purpose of military application.
But this again sounds eerily reminiscent of what we hear coming out of certain places in America right now.
But here, what I'm emphasizing here, and what I want to kind of tie into what you said, is that this is the first time in modern history that a major world power has invested serious financial and personnel resources to do this, and it's very, very clear, you know, in Nazi Germany's case. So we have this cauldron, this crucible, that, you know, I take kind of almost diametrically the opposite tack that a standard academic historian would give you of this Aryan physics. We know what the failures are. I mean, they're palpable, they're blatant. But the reason we don't know about the successes, and the reason that we're only hearing about them now, is not only German reunification, but precisely because that crucible was in the SS. It was all classified. It was also deeply black. But yeah, by freeing them from so-called Jewish physics, what they're really saying is, we want you to think outside the box. We want you to come up with a completely different paradigm of physics. And if it's engineerable, go do it.
Okay. Now, interestingly enough, just last week we spoke with Peter Lavender. Do you know him and his work?
Oh yes, yeah, I know Peter.
We were delighted to talk with him. And of course he's somebody who is a document researcher like yourself, and he described to us how he went to the very famous archivist Dr. Wolf, who showed him the archives of the SS Annenerbe, and his words were that his jaw dropped. He never knew such a thing existed. And it's really interesting to us that you've been down that same rabbit hole. And what I'd love to ask you about, if this doesn't deviate from your thought line here, is what is the connection between this hard but brilliant and out-of-the-box physics with the occult?
I think, again, if you go back to the remarks I began with, I think if you go far enough back and look at certain types of texts, for example, the Hermetica, okay, and read them without the standard academic approach, with metaphysics eyeglasses on, and read them rather as a topologist, as a mathematician would read these texts, or as even a materials engineer, you know, might read these texts. What pops out of these things is a profound metaphor of a physical medium that creates information, okay? And that's a very modern idea. In fact, it's so modern, you know, it starts popping up in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and begins to kind of spread from there. All of this stuff is popping out of the Soviet Union. So in other words, way back when, if we go back to the Hermetica, here we're dealing with a text approximately, give or take, you know, 2,000 years old. So in other words, but it's an Egyptian text, even though it's written in Greek. Its provenance is clearly Egyptian. Okay, so this is very old, and yet it contains this profoundly sophisticated physics metaphor. Okay, that's what really popped out at me, you know, when I was reading these texts. It wasn't that I was supposed to be looking and seeing Platonic universals, you know, the chair of all chairs, and, you know, the horse of all horses. No, none of that was what was popping out of me. What Plato's talking about is topology. He's talking about common surfaces with common forms, okay? So I'm looking at this, and then I'm looking at the Nazis, and they're coming up with these theories, essentially, in the 20s and 30s, that are looking at the physical medium as an engineerable reality. In other words, in a certain sense, as an information-creating medium. Okay? So, and again, the key to creating stable information is rotation, okay, torsion, and so on and so forth. So I'm thinking, well, this appears to be precisely what we see going on with this Bell project. They are somehow pursuing this idea of physics. And one of the things that leapt out at me that kind of made this connection very clear is in my book, The Philosopher's Stone, I refer to a fellow by the name of Himmler's Rasputin. If you can imagine Heinrich Himmler having a personal Rasputin. Well, this guy's name is Carl Maria Villegut, okay, and he has a number of aliases that he wrote esoteric treatises under. But his basic conception is that the whole universe arises out of a tension between two counter-rotating spirals which create the world egg, okay? And when I saw that, I thought, oh boy, because of course in the Bell, you know, which I rationalize as basically a kind of a hyperdimensional torsion physics device, you've got these two counter-rotating drums into which they're putting this high-density liquid, which I think may have even incorporated an isomer as one of its components. And of course, an isomer is one of these high-spin isotopes that if you de-excite it, it'll release massive amounts of energy. Well, you've got these two counter-rotating drums, and I'm thinking, well, here's the physics that they're doing, and we've got these two counter-rotating things. And over here, Himmler's Rasputin is saying, well, this is all coming out of two counter-rotating systems, you know. So I think clearly you had an ideological culture in the SS that, rather than inhibiting scientific progress, really kind of forced them to pursue all of this higher dimensional physics.
It actually gave them an inspirational boost.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And, you know, the kind of the final nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned, is if you look at the swastika itself, you know, and view that as not so much the corporate logo of the Nazi Party, but as an ideogram of this whole physics idea. Well,
it looks like a vector diagram.
Yeah, it looks like a vector diagram, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a subsystem of rotation, you've got a subsystem of stress, and you throw them together and twist that thing, and there's your parallel transports in the tensor calculus, and voila, you know, you're on your way. Now,
but in a sense, that symbol came out of India.
So no, sure,
you
yeah.
say that they actually went back to the original meaning of the symbol and picked up on it because it was supposed to spin.
Bingo, exactly. And you know, if you kind of can imagine Walter Gerlach being challenged, you know, let's assume the project's underway when the Nazis take power. Gerlach got his wish, he got funding from the Weimar government, and he's doing his spin experiments, okay? And he was fascinated with spin and magnetic resonance and gravitation. You know, he corresponded with Austrian physicist Turing. You know, the Lenza-Turing effect, satellite drag, and all this, you know, this was his bag. So imagine the Nazis come in and say, well, Professor Dr. Gerlach, we're going to shut your project down. You know, it looks too suspicious to us. It's dealing in areas we don't want to deal with. You know, it's just not part of our ideology. Well, all Gerlach has to do is say, Herr Himmler, it's right there on your armband. Okay? He's, you know, he's already sold them, you know, in a certain sense. And you're right. Because the other thing about the Bell that I should mention in this context with India is that this serum 525 that they're putting inside this device and spinning up, well, number one, it's a liquid. Number two, it's of heavy density. Number three, it's of kind of a maroonish violet color, okay, and very heavy. So I'm thinking of a liquid metal, okay, mercury, so probably mercury is one thing, and there's your connection to India. Because, of course, as you know, in the Vimana texts, you have references to mercury vortexes. And, just to kind of make a final nail in the coffin, mercury is kind of an ideal candidate if you're going to use plasmas in this thing. And again, you know, you have astrophysicists in Germany, Hüdermans, looking at the sun, thinking, okay, we've got nuclear fusion up there, and they've already noticed the sun rotates, but the plasma is rotating at different velocities, so you've got this differential rotation, they call it, but that's just a fancy word for, you know, it's rotating at different velocities, and they're putting all this together in this device.
What
So,
about the Vimanas, you know, the what was in essence flying saucers way back when?
right.
Do you think that they might have gotten the idea there?
From those ancient texts? Let me put it this way. I don't think it's even necessary to say that that might have been a motivation. However, within the culture of the SS that is conducting this research, you're going to have one department, the Ahnenerbe, reading these texts and taking them to the scientists to analyze, and the scientists are going to look at these things and say, oh, isn't that interesting? Because over here, Professor Dr. Gerlach has been studying this. He won a Nobel Prize for examining aspects of this type of physics, and he's been investigating and researching ever since. And they're putting these two things together. I think that's what's happening in Nazi Germany. They're doing the first attempt, in a certain sense, to go back at these ancient texts and say they contain a scientific metaphor and therefore a technology. And we have these papers now that we can see this. Let's try and reconstruct it. This is a vital thing, because that means they have also seen, and this is again a part of Nazi ideological belief, that there was a very sophisticated ancient civilization. So in another sense then, yeah, they're trying to reconstruct this stuff. In that sense, they're kind of a resurrection of Atlantis.
Mm.
So yeah.
And are they looking at the Egyptian pyramids? And
they're
the
looking at
Sumerian
everything.
seals, and they're getting all kinds of clues.
Oh yeah, absolutely they are. You know,
Because at exactly the same time as this, they were mounting expeditions all over the world to try and get hold of
yes.
anything they could get hold of.
Oh yes.
They would give them clues to all of
Well,
this, right?
one of in this regard, this idea of an ancient civilization and trying to get clues into it. You're familiar with the 38-39 Schaefer expedition to Tibet. Okay?
Yes.
Well, Himmler is a personal sponsor of this. What I find interesting is that in spite of the heavy influence of the British Raj in Tibet, the Nazis not only were able to gain entry into the Potala from the regent, they came out of Tibet with an entire copy, as Peter Levenda's research establishes, an entire copy of the Kangshur, this ancient Tibetan epic, which is supposed to be about this very sophisticated ancient civilization. And they make it back to Germany with this.
And they knew its importance.
Oh yes, absolutely they did. Absolutely they did.
So some of their technology could have come from Tibet as well, from Tibet.
I think some of their technology some of their thinking has to come from looking at these texts and looking at all of these very abstruse ideas in physics and putting them together, because they fit so snugly at places at times that it really is astonishing. And I didn't dare write about any of this when I when I was a professor. That's why I wait until after I get out of there, and now I'll write it down.
Well, the least one can say about it is that that this is all the work of intuitive genius.
Yes,
I mean that's the least one can say.
Yeah, that's
actually.
the least that one can say.
Yeah.
And again, the fact that we have an organized department of the government, and a secret one at that, doing this, that means it's organized.
Yep.
And that to me implies that, as you're implying, that to me indicates that there is some deliberation being taken in thinking and rationalizing all of this out.
Okay. Now let me just dispose of one question here that our viewers will want me to ask. Actually, and secretly I want to ask it myself too.
Okay.
And this is the claimed influence of the Vril Society, those young girls who were channeling, remote viewing, accessing clairvoyant information, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
That's been much vaunted by theorists who claim that they were accessing information that may have come from other realms or other planets or whatever.
Right.
What's your take on that?
I don't base my analysis of the Bell Project or anything like that on channeled information or on neo-Nazi sources. My problem with this story is precisely those two things. That it comes, first of all, from a source that is anecdotal and secondly, that the ultimate source that's putting it out has some very shady kind of neo-Nazi ties, okay? And there's no other corroboration of it, other than the fact that we know that something called the Vril Society did exist. And we know it because it was the German rocket scientist Willy Lai that first mentioned it when he came over to this country to escape the Nazis. Okay? So we know that that society existed. We don't know much about it. They did publish a small, thin little brochure in Berlin prior to the war. I haven't been able to get a hold of it. I don't know what its contents are. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a story that, number one, has kind of a suspect origin. And number two, I haven't been able to find anything other than this story to corroborate that the Nazis are doing this. I do know that the Ahnenerbe is doing research that we would now consider paranormal or psychic or remote viewing or what have you. Certainly they were. So you've got a general context in which something like that might have taken place. But they are alleging that this took place toward the end, in fact, in some cases during World War I and toward the end of World War I, long before the Nazis are even on the scene.
I thought it was in the 20s.
No, it was no. There, okay. I think one of these was 1916, and another one was in 19. And again, I may be mistaken. 1919, I think, close to Berchtesgaden, which is, you know, another unusual little coincidence in this story. But
did you investigate the remote viewing, like the origins of remote viewing in the Nazi?
No, I haven't. That's an aspect of the story, I think, again, that is going to come out eventually. The problem now is getting, there are massive amounts of Ahnenerbe documents in the U.S. National Archives, but many of them are still unavailable. So the problem is being able to tell a complete story. You see, that's the whole problem here. It's not that I don't think that there is one, but right now all we have with the Vril Society is a kind of a general kind of corroboration of a context.
Yeah, and presumably you're also sort of invoking Occam's razor by saying it's not necessary to understand that.
Right, exactly. It's not necessary because you have another occult influence at work already within the SS that has a specifically detailed conceptual relationship to the physics being investigated with the bell, and that's this guy Villigut.
Yeah.
Right, so you really don't even need to go there. It would be kind of nice icing on the cake, you know, if they figured out, well, consciousness plays a role in this too, and we're going to investigate that. Well, if they're rationalizing things to that extent, yeah, then we're in even deeper trouble.
Okay, now, after all those fascinating setups,
okay,
our viewers here who are thinking, this sounds like a detective story,
or
it sounds like Columbo. You know.
Yeah.
What was the bell? Okay. What were they trying to do? Okay. And what is known, what is not known, what is theorized, and why is this important?
Okay. Let me give you the basic data points, and then I'll give you how I kind of rationalize them. My rationalization of it is a bit different than Igor Vitkovsky and Nick Cook, although I kind of build on some aspects of their analysis. First of all, it's a device, it's bell-shaped. It stands about 12 to 15 feet high, 9 to 12 feet wide. It's either cased in a kind of a ceramic metal or just plain old ceramic. It's got heavy-duty electrical cabling ports around the device. Inside the device, there are two counter-rotating drums, and I want to be clear here. The data that we have does not specify the internal configuration of those drums within the bell. These two counter-rotating drums had a serum, this serum 525 I mentioned earlier, the heavy maroonish red, probably mercury compound. It is cryogenically cooled, either by liquid oxygen or liquid nitrogen, and it is close to an electrical power plant and sounds like a beehive. Okay, the electrical power plant is, to kind of put a hyperbole on it, mere yards away. Okay, from the installations that the bell is being tested in. All right,
is that the kind of hum you get from a high voltage generator?
Yes. Okay. Now, let's put all these things, those are the data points. And the final...
And this is known how, Joe?
This is known by an SS general by the name of Jakob Sporenberg, who was part of this project because he was the general that was tasked at the end of the war to go in and murder 60 of the scientists involved with the project. In other words, the Nazis want to keep this thing absolutely quiet.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, that's how all this comes out. He's tried for that crime by a Polish war crimes tribunal because, of course, Poland slid westward and took over parts of Pomerania and Silesia that were formerly German provinces. And the bell was tested in that part of Germany that then became Poland after the war. So Poland assumed jurisdiction over this man for that crime, and we know it by the affidavit that he gave at that war crimes trial. Okay? But it's important again to realize it's after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, it's after the collapse of the East German state and basically the shotgun wedding, you know, that was had in 1989, that all of this comes out. Okay? Now, Sporenberg also describes the effect of the device on plants. Plants exposed to the field of this thing when it was operating would decay to a kind of a brownish gray goo within a matter of either hours or weeks. You know, this would vary.
Right, and they come apart.
Yeah, they just literally fall apart, you know, this blue. And they would do so without putrefaction. The first time it was tested, apparently the Germans had not done something correctly, and 7 of the original scientists of the project were killed when it was tested the first time. Later on, apparently they learned how to kind of control some of these deadly effects a little bit more reasonably. But those are the data points. And one little final bit of information, a final bit of data point. When it was tested underground, it had to be tested in a room lined with ceramic bricks over which were placed rubber mats. After each test, concentration camp victims would come in, remove the rubber mats, burn the mats, and then scrub down the ceramic bricks with brine. Okay, that had to be done for some reason after each test.
Radioactivity?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Again, and I'm mentioning that because it's a crucial data point. Then, when it was tested outside, it was tested apparently inside this hinge-like structure that is near all of these strange installations with this electrical power plant right there, you know. This hinge stood in a kind of a basin, a pool, it looks like, that would have contained some sort of liquid. Around the perimeter of this pool, there are, and you can see this on the History Channel documentary with Nick Cook, you know, Igor takes Nick down into this structure and you can see these entry ports for all of this heavy-duty electrical cabling, okay? And apparently when tested at night, these concentration camp inmates described this barrel-like thing that would glow, a pale blue glow, and it would rise above the tree line and kind of sit there, and then it would fall back down, okay, lower back down. So those are our data points. Okay, I don't think that the dimensions of the device at this point in my research are functionally significant. So let's turn to the cryogenic cooling, okay? We're dealing already, we know, with a device that is using these 2 counter-rotating cylinders, and I suspect that their centrifuge isotope technology had something to do with this because they're using ultra-high mechanical rotation. In other words, this is a precision machine, okay? And it's being cryogenically cooled. And the first thing that I think of is superconductivity. You know, again, a high-spin system, little resistance. It's a kind of a self-contained little bubble of its own.
Was superconductivity understood in the physics of that time?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the next thing is we have this mysterious substance which they're putting into these cylinders and spinning up at high speed. I think that the presence of this power plant and the sound of the bell as a beehive indicates that this whole thing was electrically pulsed with extremely high voltage direct current electricity, okay? and that the drums were set up, and Igor agrees with me here, this is his analysis that I'm borrowing from, that you have a cathode and an anode, and this will arc to the center, and as this stuff is spinning and cohering along the same plane of rotation and being pulsed, electrically pulsed, it's going to drive it inward, create little plasmoids, and you're going to get even more spin out of this thing. So in other words, the way I'm rationalizing the device, ultimately, is they are attempting to maximize by every possible means this extreme torsion shear effect. This is exactly what they're going after. They're trying to figure out if they can manipulate and engineer the fabric of space-time.
With what end?
To what end? Again, I think there's these three purposes in mind. The Bell is part of the departmental oversight, let's say, of the Bell, is three things. First, you have some attachment to the Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, which is a super secret SS entity that is pulling every patent application within the Third Reich and later occupied Europe that has national security implications. Number two, it's under an entity called SS Entwicklungsstelle 4, which means Development Area 4. Okay? The mission brief of that department is to make Germany energy independent. And it's that department that you have investigating things like controlled fusion, zero-point energy, and so on and so forth. So it's attached to that department. And then the final department that it's attached to is General Hans Kammler and his think tank down in the Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, in the Skoda Munitions Works. And the mission brief of that department of the SS is to brainstorm its way from first generation to second and third and fourth generations, and here's the key, to work out the necessary steps in the technology tree to get from one to the other, and then to do it. Mm-hmm. Okay? So the Bell is connected with all these departments, and what this suggests to me, given the physics involved here, is that they're trying to create a prototype technology, and I want to emphasize this. This thing is not a UFO. It is not itself a weapon, and it is not itself a zero-point energy device. It's a prototype technology or a gateway technology that they're using and developing to investigate each of those three areas. Okay? That, I think, is what you have with this project. But I think the results were significant enough to them by 1944 that they give it this extreme classification of Kriegsentscheidend, war decisive. So they're already seeing the military potential of this thing. This is a field propulsion potential here of just extraordinary capability, and this is a weapon potential here of just extraordinary capability. But it's a kind of a unified technology.
Now, it also sounds like it's a time machine. I mean, it sounds like it's creating what Jodie Foster entered, in a sense, in Contact.
Right. I use the term time dilation here, and I don't want relativistic associations, but I don't want people to think that this is a device that can be used as a practical device for, time travel going backward or forward into the future. But the field effects here on plants, I think, are key. And another thing I should mention is I think one of the purposes of this serum and the use of probably some isotope of mercury and nuclear isomers was precisely the fact that if they were able to achieve a severe time dilation effect, the way you're going to try and measure it is precisely by changes in radioactive decay. Okay? Mm-hmm. So I think this is yet another reason they're spinning this stuff up and pulsing it. It's kind of at one and the same time the fuel of the device and the measurement of what they're getting out of it. Okay.
But is it possible, two things.
Mm-hmm.
One, that if in spinning, which it's creating a portal in essence, it's creating a torsion field.
It's
right?
creating this twisted can effect.
But you're saying it affected plants on the outside of it.
Yes.
Is there any chance that on the inside you wouldn't have the same effect?
Good question. To my knowledge, and I think Igor Vitkovsky would probably back me up here, to my knowledge, there is no evidence that this device was constructed in such a way that you could put people into it, or plants or animals or what have you into this device. Now, that doesn't mean that, let's put ourselves in the Nazi shoes for a moment and kind of speculate. If by, say, 1942, 43, when it is very clear from the documents that Igor has gathered, they have been successful enough with this project even to split it into the physics component and the medical component, okay? Which indicates, Igor thinks, and I think that he's quite right here, that the Nazis have decided, okay, we're far enough along, we need to learn how to limit the effects of this stuff on living beings, okay? So, if this is the case, then there's nothing to prevent the Nazis from building or modifying that machine, building another one, so that they can do precisely that, okay? And that would be a logical step for them to take. But as of yet, we don't have any hard evidence that they did this. So that's all I'm saying. So yeah, it has a field around it where the effects are quite deadly.
Now, as a leap,
Sure.
and one that some of our viewers may already have been making,
Uh-huh.
if, to mirror what you said at the start of our conversation when you said, well, let's assume that the Germans have been successful in establishing some degree of nuclear weapon technology.
Right.
Let's suppose that the Americans had done something in the Montauk Project,
Okay.
as it's popularly been
Portrayed.
portrayed as some kind of a Stargate device that
Right.
involves huge amounts of electrical power, a lot of trial and error experimentation, and even the idea, you know, heaven forbid, that children picked off up the streets were used as a means of trying to push them into this thing to see if they would survive a journey.
Right.
Is this a ridiculous leap in your mind, or is this something that you're willing to entertain theoretically, that there's a connection here as this
Between
technology...
the Bell and Montauk?
Well, yeah, I mean, because as this conversation continues, I want your take on what happened to this technology after the war, the significance of Camelot.
Right.
And what happened to him, and what happened to this technology, and the deals that may have been made,
Right.
and whoever, and where it is now, what happened to it? Because
Okay.
this is not the kind of thing that's just abandoned, this is a failed project.
No, no.
Certainly not. There are too many smart people
Oh, yes.
who are too interested in keeping on playing with this incredible toy.
Okay. Well, let me dispense with Montauk. That is not a project that I have investigated deeply, okay? I've investigated enough to know that there's a lot of, if I can use the expression, wacky stuff out there, and I just don't want to go there. There's been really only one good book about it, in my estimation, and I can't even recall the title of it. From some of the descriptions of the project, yeah, it appears that they're kind of investigating similar things, but not really. So I don't make a connection between the Bell and Montauk at all in my mind intuitively. It just has too many. It's got too many elements like the Vril Society channeling all this information, and that's where we're getting this science. It's got too much of that for me. But as for where does the Bell go? The way I kind of outline in my books, it appears to me that Martin Bormann is the key figure here. And in each and every case that we see these German scientists surrendering to the Allies, let's give the example of the rocket scientists. We in the United States get sort of the creme de la creme, okay? As to where the Bell goes, in my opinion, Martin Bormann sees to it that the Allies and the Soviet Union get more or less an equal division of the technological spoils. He sees to it, according to my research, that the United States gets crucial atom bomb components, fissile U-235, infrared proximity fuses that are a nice handy thing to have around when you're trying to detonate plutonium cores, you know, all of this technology. He sees to it the United States gets. He sees to it that the Soviet Union gets a crucial Nazi scientist that had developed certain isotope enrichment technologies. Okay?
Who was that?
Baron Manfred von Ardena, who of course used cyclotrons and mass spectrometers just like Lawrence did over here. Okay? So this goes to the Soviet Union, along with the centrifuge technology. So he's seeing to it that all of this technology is being equally divided. But if you're going to have a post-war extraterritorial Nazi state, so to speak, and it's going to have organization, and if you're going to have an ongoing research project, there's two things you can't have. You can't have atom bombs, because that's going to require large enrichment plants. Of course, that's going to be an easy target. You can't have large rocket gantries. You're going to need a project that is truly sensational and would pay massive dividends, and yet be a project that you could much easier keep secret. Okay? And that's the Bell.
Okay.
So in other words, what I'm telling you is the Allies and the Soviet Union get the jets, the rockets, the infrared sights, the computers, the semiconductor chips, you know, all of this stuff, but the project that was classified war decisive, the Nazis keep to themselves. And in my research, I think that definitely a case can be made that the post-war fusion project that was taking place in Juan Perón's Argentina is really nothing more than a continuation of certain aspects of this Bell project. In other words, with all of those Nazis located in Argentina, including, as I make a case in my books, Martin Bormann himself, you have the boss, in other words, right there in the area where this secret Argentine project is being conducted. So in other words, Perón is not really the one that is in control of this. It's Bormann. He's the financier. Okay? So you have the Bell not going to the West, not going to the Soviet Union. You have it going to Argentina. Now, you mentioned Camelot.
Okay, but I'm sorry,
Sure.
I have to ask,
Sure.
don't you think there's a very good chance that what was going on in Argentina was under the purview of the United States? Because a lot of the head Nazis did go to the United States, wouldn't you say?
Well, there are Nazis that go here, but the important ones, no. And the reason I say that is that if you go back to my book, SS Brotherhood of the Bell, I pick up on something that Igor Vitkovsky very explicitly mentions in his book. And that is that it appears that the United States was desperately trying to reconstruct the personnel team of the Bell. Okay? In other words, we didn't get the people, and if we're trying to reconstruct the personnel team, that means we didn't get the documents from the project. And probably we didn't get the device. If we had the device, we probably wouldn't have needed much of the personnel. Okay? So we really didn't get much of anything. I've only been able to identify 2 Bell scientists that made it to this country. One was, incidentally, Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who was involved in the medical aspect of the project. The other one was a fellow by the name of Dr. Kurt Davis. And now this guy is an interesting character because he apparently was one of these top scientists, because he was the man that designed the power plant for the Bell. Okay? Now here's why he's significant. I have a picture of him in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and he's standing right next to Dr. Werner von Braun at NASA. You're nodding your head and smiling. You know where this is going. He's standing right next to Werner von Braun at NASA, and they're kind of pointing off to something in the distance like that. And he's a senior flight director for the Apollo program at Cape Canaveral. Okay, so in other words, as an administrator, he's got his hands in all the NASA pies. Okay, but the man isn't even a rocket scientist. He's an electrical engineer.
It's really weird, isn't it?
It's so weird,
Yeah.
you know, to go there
Yeah.
where you want me to go. It's so weird that I happen to think that this indicates that there's an alternative technology in play here
Okay.
in the Apollo program.
And,
That's-
yep.
yeah.
Let me inject a little anecdote that
Sure.
may make you smile. This is a personal anecdote, and I don't even think Kerry's heard this one. My father was a facial recognition expert who worked with the British Home Office.
Okay.
He, among many things, he invented PhotoFit, the facial recognition system used to catch crooks.
Okay.
And Identikit, which preceded it, was an idea that was stolen from him.
Right.
And every now and then the British Home Office would consult him with a special request. And I remember sitting around the kitchen table in the 1970s, when I was in my mid-20s, and my father looking at pictures of Martin Bormann.
Oh, boy.
And he had been approached by the British Home Office, who had some pictures of an old man that had been sent to them either from Brazil or Argentina, and I cannot remember which, and my father is now no longer with us. And my father was being tasked to state whether or not this man that had been found in the 1970s was Martin Bormann, and my father said yes, it absolutely was. So how about that for a little anecdote?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I've got an anecdote of my own. It's not my personal anecdote, but I mentioned in my Nazi International book that the CBS journalist Paul Manning, that was a close associate of Ed Murrow, you know, the very famous journalist that was in the UK during the Blitz and later on TV. Well, Manning wrote a book. This was after Ladislas Farrell had come out with his book, you know, Martin Bormann, the Fourth Reich, and all of that stuff. Well, Manning, I think in a certain sense, was kind of miffed at the way that they had treated a fellow journalist. And he wrote a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Okay, and he basically verified that the documents that Farragut had used in his book were real. They were legit. Okay, well, he found something else. He found that Martin Bormann, I think around 1967, had cashed a check at Manufacturers Hanover and Chase Manhattan Bank. It was cleared through Deutsche Bank in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and the check had been cashed over his own signature.
Incredible. Amazing.
I don't understand, I mean, where you can back off the link between this, I don't know how to say his name, the guy in Florida. As
Davis, Kurt Davis.
Davis, okay, and Bormann. In
Okay.
other words, you're in essence saying they no longer spoke?
Oh, no, I'm not backing off that link at all. Quite the contrary. No. I'm very much in agreement with Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra that, you know, in Dark Mission they outlined the case that by the time of these late Apollo missions, it's the Nazis that are the most significant influence inside of NASA. No, quite the contrary. In fact, one of the things I try and mention in SS Brotherhood of the Bell is that our early monitoring of these German scientists that were over here as part of our missile program and then the early space program discovered that there seemed to be a sort of chain of command between all of these Nazis still in existence, and that they even had mail drops, and they were driving these fancy cars and getting money from they knew not where. That it wasn't coming from a NASA scientist's salary. They were driving around, you know, in these Mercedes cars. But nothing was ever done about it. That's, to me, what's suspicious. Because, yeah, that clearly indicates they've got some connection to this post-war Nazi organization, very clearly and very palpably.
So what about Werner
Uh-huh.
von Braun? What about him? And the link with
With all of this?
yeah, with Davis, because if they're working together,
Uh-huh.
is there more than just a working relationship? In other words, what I'm trying to find out
Uh-huh.
is where did he fit in to this
To this
echelon?
picture? All right. Good question. I do not, in my books, speculate on what that relationship may be, but I'll do so here because I think it's an excellent question. If you look at Mr. Hoagland and Mr. Barra's hypothesis in Dark Mission, what you have ultimately is a two-track space program. You've got one that's out there for public consumption with the rockets and, you know, all the fireworks and, you know, flag waving, mom and apple pie. And then there is something else. It's like you're dealing with a black hole of news. There's news stories around it, and then there's this big black hole right in the middle that's conspicuous for its blackness. Okay. Well, this little picture of von Braun and Davis, to me, is sort of the icon of what you're seeing with this two-track space program. Because very clearly these two men are engaged in a private conversation that's behind glass. They're both wearing their earphones. They're both kind of close to each other, and they're pointing off in the distance to something, okay? So I think this relationship goes back to Nazi Germany, because I do know that Davis was also part of von Braun's team at Peenemünde, okay? And what he was doing for von Braun there was he was constructing the measuring equipment for these stationary rocket test gantries that the Nazis had built there. But he's also got this connection to the Bell. Now this is why I find this question interesting. Because if you go into the Cooper Cantwheel documents, Magic 12 documents, and I'm not arguing for or against their authenticity. I'm saying I'm looking only at the internal evidence of the documents themselves. They kind of corroborate this picture because what they suggest is that these Nazi paperclip rocket scientists were brought in to look at this Roswell wreckage. And the first question that occurs to my mind, well, why bring in Nazi scientists if you suspect this is E.T.? You're going to want to keep that as classified as possible from your former enemy, okay? But you bring him in because it looks German. And von Braun, okay, you've got von Braun and Arthur Rudolph and all these Nazi scientists looking at this stuff, and they come up with this explanation of what this is. It's some sort of neutronic engine with fusion that's taking place and so on and so forth. And that tells me that if that's true, then somebody, if it's disinformation, somebody knows that Davis and von Braun communicated something way back in Nazi Germany, and that von Braun knew enough about this other secret project to be able to say that to his American interrogators. And hence we go back to that picture. What that picture represents to me is that this two-track space program begins in World War II and in Nazi Germany. Because what do you have? You've got rockets that are very visible, and you've got this Bell thing and all of this secret stuff that really doesn't even come out until after German reunification. And the Nazis are seeing to it that the Soviet Union and the United States get the jets and the rockets. But they're keeping this to themselves.
If they're keeping it to themselves, what have they been doing with it in the last 63 years?
Excellent question. Because if you can imagine, let's just go back. You've got Martin Bormann sitting in Argentina with a joint bank account with Juan Perón. that's sitting on top of almost $800 million. That's a hefty chunk of change at that point in history. Properly invested, and Borman was a financial whiz. I mean, there's no doubt about this. He knew how to move money and make money. Properly invested, you can sustain this kind of independent project, move it around. At some point, I think, it's going to require a partner if it's going to be made big and practical and usable, okay? But yeah, in 63 years, it's very feasible to me that they've worked out the medical bugs, you know, that you can put somebody inside one of these contraptions and fly it around, okay? Yeah, it's very conceivable to me that this would be possible. It's conceivable to me that at an even earlier date, you could take aspects of that technology and wed it to more conventional technologies to kind of boost their efficiency, so to speak. This is why I think that picture of Davis and von Braun at NASA is very telling. Because if Davis is involved in Apollo and in the Bell, again, that to me points to an alternative technology possibly in play. That and other things. I'm certainly not arguing the whole case on that. So yeah, in 63 years, what could they do with this? You know, project the learning curve. You know, to me, it's very feasible. The medical issues have been solved. They may have been able to find, excuse me, a practical application for free energy. But, you know, here's the bad news. Once again, they may have been able to weaponize this stuff. And that, to me, is the scariest part.
But if I understand you right, you're suggesting there's an isolated group of Nazis, maybe their descendants,
Right.
Somewhere in South America, probably Argentina,
Brazil, Chile.
Brazil, etc. Yeah. With access to this salvaged and exported exotic technology with continued funding and continued protection from somewhere that are doing what? They're not having to pay their electricity bills, they're flying around, looking around and weaponizing it against who? This doesn't seem to make sense on its own.
Okay. Let me give you a context. The modern financial meltdown, to me, is a sign that there is a breakdown occurring between the old post-war détente. And what do I mean by that? The founders of the Bilderberg Group were Lawrence and David Rockefeller. Rothschild was involved. That represented kind of the Anglo-American corporate interest. But on the European side, who is the principal founder? Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Who's Prince Bernhard? He's an SS officer, and therefore, if you still have an extant post-war Nazi chain of command, and we've already mentioned that we do, if you have an extant post-war Nazi chain of command, then an SS officer like Bernhard answers to his chief, which is Martin Bormann, who holds an SS 4-star general's rank. Okay? But Bernhard is also a vice president of, oh looky looky, IG Farben. Okay? Which incidentally, I want to point out, IG Farben was only finally completely liquidated in what year?
I have no idea.
2003.
Really?
Yes. This corporation was so big and so huge, and all of these licensing agreements that it had all over the world were in such a tangle that it took literally that long to finally get rid of the whole thing. That's an enormous amount of power.
But did
Now,
Bormann report to von Braun?
No. Von Braun reported, if anyone was reporting in that chain, it's von Braun reporting to Bormann. Okay?
Okay.
But let's get back to Prince Bernhard. Because present at these early Bilderberger meetings is a very significant figure. It's Dr. Hermann Josef Abs, who is the CEO of Deutsche Bank, one of the world's largest international banks. The bank that incidentally cleared Bormann's check in Buenos Aires that was drawn on Manufacturers Hanover and Chase Manhattan, big Rockefeller banks, okay, Morgan Rockefeller interests. So putting all of these little pieces together, what it looks like to me is that the Bilderberger Group's first secret purpose after the war was to take all of this liquid cash that is sitting in the hands of these post-war Nazis and move it through these Western banks, make it available to these Western bankers, and a lot of it, I suspect, was even kept off the books. Okay? They're laundering a huge amount of money, in other words. Now, here's the problem. I like to say, and I thank Richard Hoagland for this kind of analogy, because he came out with this one at a conference, and I just love it. With Martin Bormann, we're dealing with a Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm, okay? So in other words, when they're negotiating these deals, you know, that we agree with you, corporate fascism is the way to go, and we're agreed that world domination is kind of a cool idea, and we're willing to play ball with each other, okay? And here's a lot of money to do it, you know? Well, when you're dealing with someone like Bormann, you're dealing, as I said, with Dick Cheney with no warmth and charm. That money is going to come with a lot of strings attached, and when the markers come due, you'd better be able to pay. And if, with Bormann, you have an intelligence organization that was headed up by his friend Heinrich Müller, who I also believe escaped Nazi Germany, the actual head of the Gestapo, you're dealing with people that can not only make threats, but carry them out, even against the extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. Okay?
But the U.S. won the war. Why would
Sort
the
of.
U.S. let the Nazis go to Argentina with their blessing
Simple.
without having their hands in that pie?
Simple, exactly. They've got their hands in that pie.
Okay.
And Bormann, as I've said, has negotiated. Again, this is a part of, I know you're under time constraints, so for me to answer that question, I'd have to keep you here, okay? But
We
basic,
little time here.
well, basically what we have with Bormann is working out a deal to surrender all these atom bomb components to the United States, okay? So in other words, Bormann already has a certain amount of moral leverage over the United States. He could say, he could easily expose the whole thing and expose the United States as having made a deal with the devil. It's a kind of a classical Mexican standoff, okay? That's part of the problem that we're faced with. And again, part of this deal includes all of this German military intelligence that gets kind of slid into the CIA, you know, but remains operationally under the control of the very same Nazi general that it was in control of during the World War itself.
And there's a whole bunch of
Oh yeah.
and there's a whole bunch of mind control technology.
Oh,
We haven't
yes,
even
exactly.
gone there.
I mean, on and on this goes, you know. And for me, the real point is once we make that deal with the devil, we say, okay, Martin, or whoever, we need you to take care of some business, and we don't want to sully our lily white American hands with it, okay? But we know that you have the people that can do this. Sure. But in doing this deal, anytime that happens, you have just put yourself in the position to be blackmailed. And these people will do it. In other words, they can expose you as being involved in these sordid affairs around the world. So I think the whole result of this deal with the devil, and I think we begin to realize it right around the 1950s with Eisenhower. Because what's he warned against when he leaves office? Military-industrial complex. And he knows all of these Nazis, okay? He knows these Nazis because he fought them. And I think the warning he's giving the American people, and for that matter the West, as a matter of fact, is not so much against the homegrown American military-industrial complex, but who's infiltrating and weeding their way into all of these positions of power and influence within it, namely Nazis, okay? This is a very... I'm sorry to be so inarticulate here because I'm trying to connect a lot of dots very quickly for you. But yeah, I think the ultimate reason is they've got a gun to the Anglo-American elite's head. And to bring it up to modern times, and again, I'm simply speculating here in answer to your earlier question. But the behavior of the corporate elite at the bailout hearings with this business of no oversight okay? And the kind of pronouncements coming out of major banking leaders and families and groups and so on strike me as not being acted out panic, but genuine panic. And as I go around the world, I see panic, but it's not near the hysteria and pitch that it is in this country coming from Europe. There's certainly panic in Iceland, but it seems like the further east we go, the less panic and hysteria there is. But it's this bailout without oversight idea that looks to me, that's the kind of behavior of someone who's being blackmailed with a gun to their head. Well, we want a lot of money, but we can't tell you what it's for.
This is a very, very interesting thesis.
Yeah, it's very suspicious. Now, to put it into context with Nazis, and I think the reason, you know, perhaps for your question, is that the only thing I see within the context of recent history in the last 60 to 70 years that could put that extremely powerful Anglo-American corporate banking interest or elite in that kind of peril is precisely an entity that had enormous amounts of liquid capital that it moved into their banks and left there for a very long time as part of a deal. We'll give you this money, do with it what you will, leave us alone.
Is this a research angle that you would like to follow in the coming months as more information becomes available about the current crisis?
I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I touch on these things only when it seems like the physics aspects lead there, you know, but I get asked this question a lot, so I've kind of speculated, you know, reasoned out this kind of scenario. But I can tell you this. I'm researching a book, writing a book now, that deals with, I hope effectively, deeply seated and rooted reasons for this very strange connection between physics and finance that seems to pop up over and over and over again. And I'll only say this, it's very deeply rooted and very, very old.
Yes. That's a beautiful thought to leave a lot of people to ponder. Something
leave them hanging.
Something that Peter Levender mentioned beautifully succinctly when we talked to him last week. He said, look, the whole world can't go broke. Someone's got to have the money.
Exactly.
And something that seems very obvious to us when we're knocking this subject around between us is that if you look at all the black projects, all the modern day equivalents of the Bell experiments, wherever they are, on this planet or even elsewhere, then, you know, this is costing money. And if you think of money as energy, it's like where, you know, this energy is being drained out of the global circuit and it's going somewhere.
Where is it going?
Yeah, where's it going?
Exactly.
Which is another way of reframing the same question that I believe you're asking. Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, just to draw together some of these strings, and there are a lot of strings.
Oh, yes.
I mean, and I know that you don't even pretend that this is tidy.
Oh, no. No, I certainly don't.
And it's a little bit like the sort of, you know, outtakes after a movie. What happened to this character and what happened to that character? Are you assuming that Hans Camelot ended up wherever Martin Bormann ended up?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you assuming that the reason why the Nazis never actually used their arguably well-developed nuclear technology, and this is another whole interview to talk about the evidence for that, but we support you in your thesis that it looks like it was far more advanced than anyone has publicly given them credit for.
Right.
But they never used it, even though they tested it and they had it for quite a few years. Was this because they were planning to use it as a bargaining chip later?
Possibly. But I think you could possibly also make a case. Look, one of the things that I'm kind of a military strategy games buff. I play these things all the time. It's my entertainment. You know, I do this like people watch TV or movies. Okay. And you know as well as I do that the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front achieved this just staggering kill ratio against the Red Army, against the Russians.
Yeah.
In other words,
millions of Red soldiers.
Half of the casualties of World War II were inflicted by the Nazi war machine on Soviet Russia.
Yeah. And, you know, I had never understood how such a tiny nation could go up against all the Russian soldiers and just knock them all out. I could never understand that.
Exactly. And, you know, from my amateur military historian's standpoint, conventional wisdom or operations here fail to account for all of this. And incidentally, Russia recently, I think in the last few years, disclosed the fact that its actual casualties may have been as much as 10 to 15 million more than that 25 million we've been told. So, you know, this tiny, bothersome little country is not only fighting the United Kingdom and later on the United States and virtually everybody else, but all of that to them is just kind of a sideshow. This enormous military campaign is taking place on the Eastern Front, and to my mind, is as competent and tactically brilliant as the German army was. This doesn't explain it all to me. So there's something else going on here.
And do you have a theory?
Yeah, oh yeah, I write about it in my first Nazi book, Reich of the Black Sun. There are persistent rumors that come out of Russia, beginning in the war, that the Nazis are using something on the Eastern Front that they are not using against the Western allies, simply because, of course, the communists, the Bolsheviks, are their ideological enemies. You know, so yeah, they're subhuman. We can use all of this grisly technology we have on them.
Are you suggesting biowarfare?
No, I'm suggesting perhaps radiological bombs. I am absolutely certain that they're using some prototypical or first-generation fuel-air bombs. And if you don't know what a fuel-air bomb is, that's a conventional bomb with the explosive punch of a tactical nuke. Now I'll go further. I'll tell you how they're using them. They're using them in rocket-launched multi-barrel artillery batteries. So if you can say the phrase tactical nuke and carpet bombing, you get an idea of, you know, this carnage that they're inflicting on the Red Army. And it's so bad that in 1941, during the Battle for Moscow, when the Germans are doing this stuff, the Soviets, through Sweden, tell the Germans that if they don't cease and persist, they'll start using poison gas. You know, it's that bad.
But they're also, I mean, besides that fascination, besides that fascinating induction from those circumstances, there are eyewitness reports of people who report something that look exactly like a nuclear blast.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, you've got all of this stuff going on. So,
sorry. Could you say that again?
Yeah, you've got all of this stuff going on the Eastern Front that is inexplicable without, in my opinion, the use and deployment of all of these advanced Nazi weapons. So that's, I think, why we don't hear of it. And a final point in that respect is, during the war, Stalin's government is going to be loath to admit that it is facing an enemy that is that much more technologically superior.
It's embarrassing, at least.
At the very least, it's embarrassing. But imagine in the Red Army, when the morale, with this slaughter, this bloodletting that's going on, that you have to have commissars literally threatening to shoot anyone who deserts just to maintain morale at some of these big battles. If Stalin had admitted this publicly, it, number one, I think, could have so severely weakened his government that it might have cost him his government. You know, and number two, had that been the case, it may have brought in a government that would have been willing to sue for peace. And in fact, Stalin even tried to do that in 1942.
Yes, and those reports of those generals, those commanders being willing to shoot the soldiers who would desert, this is completely contrary to everything we understand about the Russian psyche, the Russian personality, the Russian dogged resistance. It just doesn't match, does it?
It doesn't, exactly.
I
Bingo.
thought it was the Russian winter that stopped the Nazis.
Well, I mean, we get, there's all of this happy claptrap, especially in American, university and history textbooks.
Okay.
You know, America comes in, saves the day in World War I. America comes in and saves the day in World War II. You know, to me, this is just military baloney, because we come in fairly late, and if you look at American campaigns in World War II, we're kind of on the periphery of things all the time. The action's going on in the Soviet Union. So, General Winter and all that, but, you can argue against that thesis because in August of 1941, Adolf Hitler turns Army Group Center, the 2nd Panzer Army, 650 miles south out of the way to encircle some Russian forces in Kiev. When in front of them, he's 250 miles from Moscow at the end of August. And they have decimated 60% of the Red Army, and he's got one Russian rifle division standing between him and Moscow. So the war was lost not by General Winter or General Mudd, but by Hitler making this dumb, stupid, silly, indefensible military decision to take that detour.
Yeah.
Is it possible that even that is, disinfo, and that what really changed the war was the deals being made with the Americans because they decided they were fighting a losing battle, and they were making monetary deals and getting out of Germany because they wanted to rewrite history and go in a different direction?
Well, I think the deals begin to be struck. The feelers are put out for them, certainly. In the period from the fall of the 6th Army at Stalingrad up to the failure of the German offensive at Kursk in 1943, July of 1943. So it's this time period.
That's early.
That's fairly early. After Kursk, the offensive capability of the Wehrmacht is broken for a good year and a half. Okay, so it's during this period that the Nazi leadership quietly make the feelers, hope that the offensive goes well, but they lay the foundation. After the Battle of Kursk, this kicks into high gear, and you have all of these secret negotiations taking place. And I think you can make a certain argument that some of this history has been deliberately doctored to hide this.
It's a reasonable assumption.
Sure.
Let me ask you one final question, although it's an important one and it could be a big one.
Okay.
And I don't know whether it's an easy one or not.
Okay.
But that is, if there is such a thing as a central power base of the Nazis now, where is it, who are they, and what strings are they pulling? And why should we care?
Germany and some of the major politicians. That's
Germany now?
Germany, yeah.
Really? I didn't know you were going to say that.
Yeah, it's surprising as it may seem. One of the things that I looked at very carefully is the German reunification. Okay? When the Berlin Wall falls, it falls on the exact date, I forget the exact date, the numerical date in my head, but it falls on the exact date of the anniversary of Kristallnacht in 1938. It falls, and that incidentally is the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch. Okay?
Okay.
Now if you go back and recall what's taking place in East Germany at the time, there's all these mass meetings and demonstrations in Leipzig and Dresden of a bunch of East German intellectuals that are pushing for the reform of the East German state. They're not pushing for reunification. Okay? But then an amazing thing happens, and this to me is the dead giveaway. The meetings themselves begin to have lots of neo-Nazis start attending. And these people show up with cell phones, computers, and lots of money, and using typical Nazi tactics, strong-arm any opposition out of these meetings and begin to kind of steer them so that even the popular slogans that the reformers were chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people, is changed to "Wir sind ein Volk."
We are one people.
Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, okay? Now, on the other side, Chancellor Kohl's government in Bonn is very quietly but very seriously channeling money and driving this stuff. So in other words, when I'm saying you cannot have neo-Nazi cells in communist Eastern Europe suddenly popping up with cell phones, computers, all this money organized, ready to go, without having had an intelligence structure in Eastern Europe to begin with to support it. And when all of this activity happens, bang, all of a sudden Bonn has ready to go, ready to hand, a plan for reunification. And it's basically a shotgun wedding, and it's typical Hitler's tactics. Well, we'll give you the opportunity to vote on whether you want reunification. And again, what happens? When the referendum is held in those East German provinces, the neo-Nazis show up, and they are driving some of this activity to keep people voting that are going to vote for it, and to keep people that don't want that out.
But
Okay.
isn't this part of establishing one of the central planks for the European Union?
Oh,
Isn't
of course it is.
Okay.
But what does Martin Bormann say that he wants to do after the war? He wants to create a European federation or confederation which Germany will be able to dominate, and listen to his words now, by elastic political means. In other words, he's learned to speak the lingo to a T.
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay. No, but are you saying then that whatever may or may not be going on in America right now is divorced from what you just described?
Oh,
There's
no,
connection?
not at all. No, I'm very alarmed, because what I see happening in America is this, within the last 10, 12 years, is this emergence of a horrendous fascist police state snitch culture. Oh, absolutely. No, I wouldn't say it's divorced from it at all. But I am saying look to Europe and look at recent events very carefully, and look especially at the events surrounding German reunification and the moves Germany made afterward, almost immediately, to crack up Czechoslovakia and to crack up Yugoslavia. Because remember, it was West Germany, the recently reunited Germany, that was the first nation to recognize breakaway Croatia over the opposition of Washington and London. They did that unilaterally. And when Croatia got its independence, it turned around and said, oh, please help us. Will someone please help us send peacekeepers? Bang. Germany sent troops. Bang. Germany sent the Luftwaffe. Bang. Germany sold off all that communist equipment to Croatia and re-equipped the East German part of the newly absorbed East German army with Bundeswehr equipment. So look at Germany carefully. And it did a lot more. I mean, go onto YouTube. This is a kick. Because I found on YouTube a Bundeswehr Wachbataillon doing a music drill show in Cologne, okay, in 2005. Okay? And this just floored me, because here in America, you know, we have no idea that this is going on. But they come marching into this stadium, carrying the bell tree, drums a-blazing, piping out Prussia's glory, you know. So in other words, I'm looking at a restoration of all of these old Prussian military traditions right before my eyes, and the only thing they're not doing is the goose step. You know, and I'm just floored. But it scares me, because I told some friends about 5 years before the reunification even happened, I said, you watch. If it does happen, they will slowly bring back all of those military traditions. And now, you know, just 2 or 3 years later, they're holding torchlight tattoos with the Bundeswehr, again, marching in, carrying the bell tree and all these old Prussian trappings, doing this torchlight military tattoo out in front of the Reichstag, you know.
And
So
also,
it's scary to me. I mean, it's creepy.
Understood.
Obama did the
Just-
special,
yeah.
the special photo
At the
op in front
Siegeshalle.
of the
Yeah.
gate, right?
Yeah, it's a
It was supposed to be a
Siegeshalle.
very important symbol.
Oh, sure, of course. And
And
yeah, and I don't think this is a good symbolism at all. There's some people that do. You know, I'm disagreed with my good friend Richard Hoagland over this. But you know, why do we have a presidential candidate go to Berlin? Sure, it's nice to have good relations with Europe, obviously.
It's also got to do with the touch of the Kennedy.
Yeah, it's good to have good relations with Moscow and Beijing, you know, and that would seem to me to be the logical place that you would go. But Berlin?
But there's some subliminal thing going on there where, I mean, if they permeated NASA, they have to permeate, you know, the undercover, you know, lab projects thoroughly, and that means they've permeated the real secret government of the United States. And so there's an alignment there.
Okay, ask yourself this. The Hadron Collider, okay? We've got two huge counter-rotating rings, and they're going to spin up these particles and smash them together, okay? I find that whole counter-rotating idea really weird, you know, suggestively weird. But the really weird thing to me is, why is the first Christian Democratic Union Party Chancellor of Germany, after Kohl, okay, a physicist? Did you know that?
I did not.
She's a PhD in physics.
Okay.
Why is she a PhD in physics?
A PhD in physics?
Yeah, and now you know what a German PhD is like to get. You know, they don't hand them out by any means. And, you know, this to me, why is someone like that even in politics? But especially at that level. You know, this is not a PhD in physics becoming premier of Somalia. You know, this is a rather sophisticated nation technologically. So that to me, you know, it's another little indicator that we have to watch things over there very carefully.
So now, what's really fascinating here, as you have kindly pointed out, we are under pressure of time this evening. We've only done nearly 2 hours, and we could probably do another 4 without even thinking about it, because there's so many places this conversation can go.
Oh yeah.
I don't know when we would next all be in the same place at the same time, but right now I would like to say that we'd love to talk to you again on audio to explore some of these themes.
Sure, that'd be fine.
And I'm quite sure I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, if not go down right now in the escalator with a whole bunch of questions which I haven't had a chance to ask. What I do want to do is I want to thank you for your diligence, your creativity, your articulateness in explaining these concepts, which are difficult for a lot of people to grasp, because this story is so huge. You've been describing that part of the iceberg that is not often seen. And someone's got to do it, and I think you've done a wonderful job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And it's our pleasure and our privilege to assist you in that. And we look forward to seeing you again. We look forward to talking to you again.
It'll be my pleasure.
And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.